his mandate illegitimate, but what he meant as a blow exploded in his face.
Realization that Ibrahim Traoré's defiance of Western power is no longer a national matter. His voice, his symbolism, and his actions have expanded far beyond Burkina Faso's borders, echoing across Africa and reverberating in world capitals. What began as a coup to replace a failed leader has now transformed into a geopolitical confrontation, pitting a young African captain against the entrenched machinery of Western dominance. Traoré is not simply governing a small, landlocked country. He has become a figurehead in a struggle over Africa's future. The formation of the Alliance of Sahel States, EAS, in 2023, linking Burkina Faso with Mali and Niger, was the clearest signal yet that the rejection of France was not isolated but collective. These three countries, led by young military officers, declared that their destinies were tied together, that they would defend one another from external aggression, and that their sovereignty was non-negotiable. To Western powers, this was alarming because it threatened to undo decades of careful management of influence in the region. France, long the dominant power in West Africa, suddenly faced open hostility not from one, but several states at once. The withdrawal of French troops from Burkina Faso and Mali, and later from Niger, amounted to a complete dismantling of Operation Barkhane and the French-led counterterrorism strategy in the Sahel. The loss was not only military but also symbolic. It showed the limits of French power when confronted with popular resistance. The alliance also began to look beyond simple security cooperation. Leaders from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger spoke of deeper economic integration, joint infrastructure projects, and the possibility of moving away from the CFA franc. For decades, the CFA franc has been the clearest symbol of French neo-colonial control, tying African economies to the French treasury and limiting their monetary sovereignty. To even question the CFA franc is to strike at the heart of Francafrique. Traoré and his allies, therefore, represent a movement that seeks not only political autonomy, but also economic independence, something that previous African leaders often avoided for fear of reprisal. Western reaction intensified as the alliance solidified. Sanctions were expanded, loans suspended, and trade restrictions threatened. ECOWAS, under pressure from Paris and Washington, attempted to isolate the Sahelian states, but instead of weakening them, these measures pushed them closer together. In Burkina Faso, the effect was to strengthen Traoré's domestic standing. Many citizens interpreted the sanctions as proof of Western bad faith, reinforcing the idea that the West never wanted Africans to be truly independent. Popular rallies in Ouagadougou and other cities grew larger, with slogans that framed the struggle not as Burkina Faso versus France, but Africa versus neo-colonialism. The ideological battle entered a new phase when Traoré began speaking more directly about Africa's place in the world. He positioned Burkina Faso and the Sahelian bloc as part of a multipolar movement, aligning with countries that challenge Western hegemony. Russia was embraced for its military cooperation and China for its economic power. Beyond that, Traoré invoked the spirit of Pan-Africanism, calling for solidarity among African nations to resist exploitation. In his speeches, he argued that Africa is the wealthiest continent in terms of resources, yet the poorest in terms of living conditions precisely because its wealth has been systematically stolen. This message resonated not just in Burkina Faso, but in many African countries where populations felt the same frustration. The Western media campaign against Traoré escalated accordingly. He was painted as a pawn of Moscow, as an inexperienced soldier who would plunge his country into chaos, or as a populist who would eventually betray his people. Yet this media framing often backfired, as it highlighted the very arrogance and hypocrisy that Traoré denounced. Burkinabe citizens asked why Western outlets were so quick to criticize their leader, but so slow to account for France's failures after decades of presence in the region. For many, the attacks in the press confirmed that Traoré was indeed challenging something powerful and entrenched. As the months passed, the confrontation grew sharper. The jihadist insurgency did not disappear, and attacks continued in parts of Burkina Faso. But instead of undermining Traoré's popularity, the persistence of violence was often blamed on the legacy of Western failures. Citizens argued that if years of French and American presence could not solve the problem, then new approaches had to be tried. The government began experimenting with local defense initiatives, mobilizing volunteers to defend their communities. Critics warn of risks of abuses, but supporters saw it as an example of grassroots sovereignty in action. The global geopolitical environment also shifted in ways that gave Traoré some space. The war in Ukraine strained Western resources and attention, while Russia was eager to demonstrate its relevance in Africa. China, meanwhile, pushed forward with its Belt and Road Initiative, investing in infrastructure across the continent. Other powers like Turkey, Iran, and even smaller players such as the Gulf states saw opportunities to expand influence in the Sahel. This competition created room for Traoré and his allies to maneuver, playing different partners against each other while insisting on sovereignty. But the most profound transformation has been psychological. For decades, African leaders often operated within limits set by external powers. They were careful not to cross certain lines, fearful of aid withdrawal, sanctions, or even coups engineered from abroad. Traoré represents a break with this caution. His very youth, taking power at 34, signals a generational change. He speaks in a language that resonates with Africa's overwhelmingly young population, where the median age is under 20. His defiance tells them that it is possible to reject fear, to dream of dignity, to believe that Africa does not have to be permanently subordinate. This is why Traoré's struggle has drawn such attention. It is not about the size of Burkina Faso's economy or its military might, both of which are modest. It is about the audacity to confront an entire system of domination, just as Sankara inspired Africans in the 1980s. Traoré's stance has reignited the imagination of a new generation. The comparison is imperfect, as circumstances are different, but the symbolism is undeniable. Sankara's unfinished revolution finds an echo in Traoré's resistance. Of course, the risks are immense. History shows that leaders who defy Western power often face dire consequences. Sankara was assassinated. Patrice Lumumba in Congo was eliminated. Muammar Gaddafi in Libya was toppled and killed. Traoré knows this history, and it haunts his every move. Security around him is tight, but the possibility of plots cannot be dismissed. Western governments may not act openly, but the shadow of destabilization lingers. His survival will depend not only on personal protection, but also on maintaining the loyalty of his army and the support of his people. The economic challenge is equally daunting. Burkina Faso is one of the poorest countries in the world, heavily reliant on agriculture and gold mining. Sanctions and aid suspensions make governance harder. To sustain the fight for Africa that Ibrahim Traoré came to symbolize did not end with his initial proclamations or early reforms. It evolved into a longer, more complex contest of willpower, diplomacy, and resilience. If the first stage of his leadership was about announcing a rupture with the old order and laying the ideological foundation for sovereignty, the subsequent phase tested whether that vision could withstand the entrenched realities of geopolitics, entrenched elites, and the structural weaknesses that decades of dependency had left behind. It was one thing to declare independence of spirit. It was another to build a scaffolding of material autonomy in a world whose financial, trade, and security systems often punish deviation from established norms. As his administration pushed deeper into the restructuring of Burkina Faso's political economy, the backlash became more pronounced. International lenders imposed tougher conditions. Foreign investors hedged their bets, and Western governments, some openly, others covertly, sought to limit his outreach to alternative partners. Sanctions, trade slowdowns, and subtle diplomatic isolation became part of the pressure matrix. Yet, Traoré framed this not as a deterrent, but as proof that Africa's assertion of its rights unsettled the status quo. His speeches took on a tone both defiant and rallying. He urged other African states not to be cowed by threats, to form collective fronts that could resist coercion more effectively than any single nation could. This was the period in which his vision of regional solidarity took firmer shape. He pushed for Sahelian cooperation, not merely in security matters, but also in trade, infrastructure, and resource management. Memoranda were signed with neighboring states to coordinate border patrols, pool intelligence, and share resources for joint agricultural and energy projects. The rhetoric of Pan-Africanism that once lived largely in books and activist slogans began to find cautious expression in policy. The underlying message was clear. Only by standing together could African nations escape the chronic vulnerability that left them susceptible to foreign dictates. In this second act, Traoré also sought to confront the domestic challenges that threatened to hollow out his reforms. Corruption, long entrenched, did not vanish with a change of guard. He initiated sweeping audits of government contracts, arrested high-profile figures accused of embezzlement, and set up new anti-graft agencies with mixed civilian and military oversight. These moves earned him both applause and enmity. Many ordinary citizens welcomed the sight of previously untouchable elites being held to account, but critics decried selective justice and warned that such campaigns, if overly politicized, could morph into tools of repression. The media landscape likewise reflected this tension. Independent journalists found space, at times, to celebrate the resurgence of national pride. Yet many also bristled at the government's tendency to clamp down on dissent under the guise of national security. Traoré's defenders argued that extraordinary times required extraordinary measures. His detractors saw the creeping shadow of authoritarian consolidation. The balance between security imperatives and civic freedoms, never easy in fragile states, became one of the defining paradoxes of his rule. Economically, his policies began to yield modest but symbolic results. Revised mining contracts delivered higher royalties to the Treasury, some of which were channeled into rural electrification, school construction, and basic health care. Pilot projects in agro-processing aimed to reduce the country's dependence on raw commodity exports. Renewable energy projects, especially solar installations in sun-rich regions, received renewed emphasis, both to alleviate chronic power shortages and to signal commitment to sustainable development. Traoré understood that sovereignty was hollow if it did not translate into tangible improvements in daily life. Water pumps, functioning clinics, secure roads. Still, the macroeconomic indicators painted a mixed picture. Inflation rose due to external shocks and the recalibration of subsidies. Unemployment, especially among urban youth, remained stubbornly high, testing the patience of the same demographic that had initially rallied behind his message. Migration outflows, both internal and towards North Africa and Europe, continued, reflecting persistent gaps between aspiration and opportunity. In this sense, the fight for Africa was not a triumphant march, but a grinding struggle, in which every step forward was met with friction, delay, and compromise. Internationally, Traoré's profile grew. He addressed gatherings not only in African capitals, but also at forums in Asia, Latin America, and select European venues where sympathetic intellectuals and solidarity movements welcomed his frankness. He spoke of a multipolar world where Africa would not be a pawn, but a pole in its own right. He insisted that climate negotiations must account for Africa's historical marginalization, its low contribution to global emissions, its high vulnerability, and its right to develop using its resources without moralizing lectures from the very powers that had industrialized at Africa's expense. This positioning drew parallels to earlier generations of leaders: Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, Patrice Lumumba, and of course Thomas Sankara, whose bold visions often clashed with global systems. Yet, Traoré's era was different. He operated in a digital age, where narratives spread instantly, where diasporas amplified messages across oceans, and where alliances could be forged not only through formal treaties, but through network movements, trade in cryptocurrency, and partnerships with non-traditional actors. This gave his message a broader reach, but also a more volatile field of contestation. As months turned to years, the measure of his fight was less about fiery